How's it going, guys? Cody, guys, back again, dropping out another video. Right, guys, this is a story on the Sky News website, link in the description below like you always do. It's about private versus state prisons, the UK's best and worst prisons. Now, the truth is, all prisons are failing prisoners, prisoners' families, and yeah, it's just a case. So I'm going to do the story. Let's get into it. Very, very in-depth story, this. So, since the 1990s, prisons across Britain have been turned over into the hands of private firms which run them at a profit. Rather than governors, privately run prisons have directors in charge, but the prisons must still face unannounced inspections by Her Majesty's Prisons Inspectorate and receive recommendations based on the observations made. The situation at the privately run Birmingham prison became so bad in August that the government was forced to take it back from G4S to run it themselves for at least 6 months. That's now been extended. Now 10 prisons in the UK to receive an extra government funding totaling 30 million, which will tackle acute problems that they face. Not all the UK's worst prisons are run by private companies though, and not all of privately run prisons are bad. These are some of the best and worst. The worst. H&P Birmingham, G4S. Birmingham Prison, run by G4S, was the subject of an urgent notification process in August of 2018. Inspectors flagged poor assessments, a failure to achieve recommendations, and said those detained there were vulnerable. After the 2016 prison riots, Birmingham was assessed and found to be in poor in all 4 areas which the inspectorate looks at. Only the second time a prison has been ranked that way. But in the 18 months before the next assessment, inspectors found an increase in violence, with more serious assaults and prisoners feeling unsafe. Many hid in their cells, with some becoming the victims of targeted attacks. Drugs misuse have become so widespread that 1 in 7 prisoners developed a problem with illicit drugs whilst in prison, and the inspector felt affected by drugs in the atmosphere during the visit. The MOJ said there were serious concerns over safety, security and decency, and it will overtake the running of the jail for an initial 6-month period. G4S has welcomed the move. Prisons Minister Rory Stewart said there would be no cost to the taxpayer. G4S haven't welcomed the move at all because it's affecting them financially. H&P Nottingham, run by the Ministry of Justice. H&P Nottingham received an urgent protocol notification in January of 2018 for an inspection. This was the first one issued in England and Wales. The prison had been performing poorly since 2010, with repeated assessments marking safety at a poor level, the lowest grade. In 2 years, levels of self-harm rose and 8 people were thought to have taken their own lives. By January 2018, the prison had only managed to implement 2 of the 13 recommendations that the inspector had made in 2016. H&P Nottingham's action plan included recruiting 100, easy for me to say, more officers, carrying out more than 800 repair tasks and the introduction of body-worn cameras. H&P Wormwood Scrubs. Wormwood Scrubs in West London was flagged as needing urgent help in the inspector's annual report for 2017 to 2018. The report said, at H&P Wormwood Scrubs, only 9 of the 21 recommendations in the area of safety had been achieved. And for the 3rd consecutive inspection, the prison attracted the lowest possible grading in safety, which was poor. In a worrying assessment, the report added the problems there were intractable and prisoners were suffering not only appalling conditions, but an almost complete lack of rehabilitative or resettlement activity. Wormwood Scrubs is run directly by the Ministry of Justice. H&P Liverpool, or the Mansion on the Hill, or Walton Jail as it's known, right? The inspector said Liverpool prison had some of the worst conditions ever seen. As reported in the report, it was so troubling that a special evidence session was held by the Justice Committee solely to discuss it. The poor living conditions were highlighted when inspectors there went to G4S ran Alt Course, also near Liverpool, and found a distinct difference. After an inspection in 2015, 89 recommendations were made, and returning inspectors found 2 years later that only 22 of them had been met. Living conditions were described as squalid, with prisoners still residing in cells which should have been decommissioned and without working call bells. Broken windows and piles of rubbish were a common feature in the Merseyside prison, and the healthcare had also suffered, especially with the staff shortages. Without working call bells, guys, right, if you're in a cell and you're suffering a medical emergency, right, you press your buzzer and it rings through to the office, right, and then they're supposed to come and get you. They didn't have them working, guys. Playing God with people's lives. HMP Hull. Hull's prison is one of the 10 which will receive extra funding as it tackles its problems. The East Yorkshire prison, which houses more than 1,000 men, has problems with drugs and self-harm, according to a report in an unannounced inspection in April of 2018. It also struggles with overcrowding, with 2/3 of men sharing cells intended for one person. The prison has a large backlog of repairs, but inspectors said the men were good at keeping their own areas clean and tidy. Hull was given an encouraging review by the inspector, with many of its key points marked as reasonable. The best. HMP Oakwood. Oakwood is a Category C male prison based near Wolverhampton. It opened in 2012 and currently holds more than 2,000 prisoners. According to the Howard League for Penal Reform, having originally been built for 1,600, it is now overcrowded with capacity at 128%. It was subject to an unannounced inspection at the end of February and was judged to be impressive, with officials finding outcomes reasonably good against the 4 test points. Prisoners said they were treated well by admission staff on their first night, though 15% admitted to feeling unsafe despite a robust programme to tackle violence. More than half of prisoners said drugs were readily available. The rooms and communal areas were kept clean and helped provided a sense of community. The report added, and in prisoners in the self-catered wing enjoyed having their own facilities. But the inspectors were concerned about the level of force being used in the prison, as well about how many prisoners were self-harming. Several of the 7 single occupancy rooms have 2 prisoners living in them, making them overcrowded. HMP Altcourse. Altcourse near Liverpool is a Category B prison which holds more than 1,100 men, including 100 young adults, and was last inspected in November. Inspectors praised the prison for making improvements and even bucking the trend in comparison with other local prisons. Obviously, them fucking knobheads at fucking Liverpool Walton. HMP Altcourse was judged reasonably good against several key assessment points, with motivated and committed staff group forming strong relationships with prisoners. Many of the men spent 9 to 10 hours outside of their cells every day, higher than the average for a local prison. With sufficient skills and education training for the population, however, the prison has a backlog of reports produced by the National Probation Service, and inspectors found gaps in the range of interventions offered to the men. HMP Spring Hill. Spring Hill in Buckinghamshire was given outcomes of at least reasonably good in all 4 of its assessment areas when inspectors visited in December. The open prison, or a Category D prison which houses 300 men, was found to have a clear leadership, a motivated management team and a clear plan around further improvement. It was praised for being clean and tidy and supporting prisoners in maintaining relationships with their families. Education and skills provision was also steadily improving. However, 20 of the 56 recommendations made by the inspectors in 2014 had not been completed by the 2017 inspection. So, like I say, guys, contrasting stories here. The truth is, guys, right, there's 10 prisons the Ministry of Justice are currently throwing money at, right, to try and reduce violence and drug taking, right? For the 10 prisons they're focusing on and throwing money at, another 10 or 15 are going to fall into squalid, decrepit, like, conditions, treatment, regimes and everything else that comes with it. Now, like I say, prisons need to be rehabilitative. Now, most people in society want to brutalise prisoners. That doesn't aid rehabilitation, nor does it act as a deterrent. If anything, it just succeeds in making you demoralised, desensitised, dehumanised, and even more disenfranchised than when you enter the system. That creates monsters. You get kicked out with £46, and with fewer police on the streets and reoffending rates being so high, most people that leave prison go back to a life of crime. Prisons need to be turned into places solely based on rehabilitation, and you can't punish and rehabilitate at the same time. And like I say, housing prisoners in squalid conditions doesn't succeed in anything but creating monsters. Makes them more disenfranchised than when they entered. they're pissed off, they're kicked out, they're angry, they've made criminal connections, they go back to crime, fewer police on the streets, and people wonder why reoffending rates are so high. Like I say, guys, contrasting stories. There's more. Do you know what? Like I say, they've only covered a few prisons that are good and a few prisons that are bad. A mixture of private prisons and also state-run prisons or public sector prisons. I don't like private prisons personally. Why? Because you've got to think, guys, right? Private prisons. What's the aim? What's the first aim and the end goal? Financial gain. That comes at the behest of a lot of things. Security, staffing numbers, quality of food, like I say, that then has an impact onto the regime and stuff like that, the prisoners, because if there's not enough staff and then they're running skeletal staff, it has a domino effect. Who's at the bottom of that hill? Shit rolls downhill, guys. Who's at the bottom? Yes, prisoners. And they're getting fat and rich, guys. You go to prison, your family go on a prison visit, you're buying food, a cheap piece of bread with a piece of ham in that probably cost them £1 for about a fucking 100 pieces, right? And they're selling it for £2.50 or £3. They're taking you all to the bank. Then you've got prisoners inside the prison. And like I say, you're buying things on canteen and phone credit and stuff. It's all about profit margins, guys. And the facts are private prisons are getting fat and rich off your suffering and your loved ones suffering. That's the reality. Like I say, guys, there's good and bad stories in every prison. There's more bad than good, though. That's the reality, because that's prison. That's the reality of prison. All prisons are failing in some regard. The prisons that have been mentioned here, there'll be bad things happening there as well. But like I say, any prison that's going to turn around and get positive feedback and stuff. It didn't mention the IMB there. The IMB, for those that don't know, is the Independent Monitoring Board. Their job's quite similar and quite parallel to that of the HMIP, or the Her Majesty's Inspector of Prisons. But the HMIP do a great job, guys. Peter Clark is the chief executive. Him and his team go into prisons up and down the country unannounced, and they report the good, the bad and the ugly. But unfortunately, there's a lot of ugly and a lot of bad. Walton Jail specifically is a shocking jail from what I've heard. The amounts of just suicides and self-harm coming out of that prison is off the scale. Same at Nottingham. Forest Bank's creeping up there now in terms of deaths in custody and stuff like that. Just unbelievable, guys. Like I say, what society needs to remember is that 99% of prisoners, unless serving a whole life tariff, are going to be reintroduced into society at some point. It's how we treat prisoners whilst they are in prison which will dictate and determine how they act upon release. That's the reality. If you're supporting somebody in prison, you're saving that prisoner's life. I genuinely do believe that, because the importance of family ties whilst in prison can be the difference between life and death. I'm going to leave it there, guys. Let me know what you think about the story. What prisons have you been in? How would you rate them? Let me know in the comment section below. Like, comment, subscribe. Cody out.